All right, so as promised, a Sidney Crosby video as he has reached the 1,500 point mark. And it's worthy of looking at this because 1,188 games played, 550 goals, 950 assists, 1,500 points. Perfect. 550 goals, 950 assists. I like the nice round numbers. Now, he is within striking distance of 1,000 assists. He should get there next season, barring injury. Of course, there are a couple of games still left in the season when I'm recording this, and he's going to add to his playoffs total. So, at least he could. They're 1 point below the playoff line as I'm recording this. Maybe he adds to the playoff record. All right, so his playoffs, 180 games played, 71 goals, 130 assists, 201 points. So his regular season points are 15th on the all-time list. His playoff points are 6th all-time. He's tied with Jaromir Jagr. So they're tied in points for 5th, but Jagr has more goals. So Sidney Crosby has carved out quite the remarkable career for himself. And this was something that we saw coming. Back in 2005, the draft lottery was called the Sidney Crosby Sweepstakes. And I remember a lot of naysayers being like, hey, until he plays in the NHL, we don't know he's going to be any good. He might be a bust. And other recent busts would be mentioned. And so when we get up to the Connor Bedard draft, we're seeing some of that already too. But for Sidney Crosby, he really has put himself into the conversation for the best player of all time. So there's a reason I have this column here, and it's not in any particular order. It's just basically, all right, so who would be in the best players of all time category and conversation? And it does get tricky. The last time that I did this, I talked about the best players of all time, there were endless mentions of what about this guy, what about this guy, what about that guy, and it's like, okay, but the best player of all time is a whole conversation that we can have without there being a right answer. And there isn't really a right answer. Now, the generation before mine would argue Gordie Howe. A lot of them would argue Gordie Howe. He played for a very long time. He played a tough physical game. He played until he was in his 50s. If you included his numbers from the WHA, they would dwarf, in terms of goals, they would dwarf everybody's. You wouldn't be chasing Gretzky if you're Ovechkin. You'd be chasing Gordie Howe. But that's not how it worked, right? So for Gordie Howe, his numbers have been eclipsed. And I do think that for the generations coming up, there's so much of this. Well, the previous generation just sucked, so we don't need to talk about them. There's a lot of that, and I feel like it's more prominent now than it was when I was growing up. It does happen where people are like, you know what, all the players now are the best ever, so we don't care what came before. I don't like that messaging. I think it takes away from where we've been. So Wayne Gretzky, of course, is the one that I would pick as the best I've seen in my lifetime. And that's why I have that qualifier. I've always said that if I didn't see a player play, I can't make an educated conversation. I can't form an educated thought, apparently, on that player and on their career and the impact that it had. I can look at the numbers. I can hear everybody else's regalings of what this player was able to do in their history, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I can then speak with certainty afterwards, right? So that's why I don't get into who was better, Gretzky or Gordie Howe. Gretzky or Lemieux I can talk about, sure. Lemieux, if not for his back, he probably would have eclipsed a lot of Gretzky's numbers. He might very well be the guy who would have the number one goals total if he'd been healthy throughout his career. But that's where the ifs come in too, right? So for Mario, he was a different player than Gretzky. Their points totals were very, very similar, but they were very different players. And just if you watch them play, you'd know they were very different players. They were exciting for different reasons. Lemieux had that fantastic deking ability that you guys have seen the highlight reel goals. Gretzky would set up in his office behind the net, and you would know where that puck was coming from, and you still couldn't stop it. It's similar to the argument I've seen with Ovechkin, who I've got on the board, where the argument with Ovechkin is, well, he scores all his goals from the same spot, so, Well, if you know it's coming from that spot and you still can't stop it, that says a lot for Ovechkin's goal-scoring ability. Same as with Gretzky with setting up in his office behind the net. Jaromir Jagr has to be in that conversation. Jagr played a very long time, is still playing hockey at home. The reasons for that, of course, are complicated and all that, but he's still playing hockey and he's still putting up points and goals at home. And he's first ballot Hall of Famer. I don't think there's any argument with that. And then you can mention Guy Lafleur. Guy Lafleur, just before the era of Gretzky, Lafleur was the guy. He was the star. Late 70s, he was it, right? And you had the Montreal machine that they had there. Just that team was ridiculously over the top talented from top to bottom. I'll be doing a video once the season's done, and Boston's 63 win season being as it is. I have no problem comparing the roster of this year's Bruins to the Montreal Canadiens of the 70s that had that wins record first, right? So, or at the very least only lost 8 games in a season, because that's nothing short of remarkable. But Guy Lafleur was a big part of that team, and he grew into that role. He wasn't handed that role, he earned it, right? That was in an era where Montreal would have multiple star players coming up, and you could have that luxury of taking your time with them. Phil Esposito. Esposito revolutionized things from a goal-scoring perspective. He set records. He was the records holder before Gretzky came along and just annihilated everything. And so I think Phil should be on the board along with his teammate, Bobby Orr. Bobby Orr revolutionized defense. I did the video on Bobby Orr's career not that long ago. And if he had played a full career, if not for his knees given out, Bobby Orr would have totals in that 1,500 point plus range as well. Might very well have had 500 goals from the blue line. It could have happened. There's definitely no argument that Bobby Orr could not have achieved those kinds of numbers. I didn't put Bork on the board, so I know people are going to mention Bork, but then there's a bunch of others. You got to mention Nick Lidstrom, and you got to mention Yzerman. I don't have Yzerman on the board, but I do have Jacques Plante. Jacques Plante revolutionized goaltending as well. So did Patrick Roy. So when you talk about guys who revolutionized the game, Patrick Roy brings in the butterfly, makes it popular, and all of a sudden we had a bunch of goalies coming up out of the Quebec League, Quebec-born goaltenders, and where the era of kids wanting to play goal and you get those big athletic goaltenders, where that starts, it feels like that's with Patrick Roy, that he was the inspiration for that. And he was the start of that trend towards the bigger athletic goaltender, which now we've gotten to the point where goalies have to be 6'5", 375 pounds of pure muscle and wear huge pads and make it so that if they're standing in front of the net, they can basically be drinking a beer. You're not getting through them. But while I may be putting that to extreme lengths, I think it starts with Patrick Roy and the butterfly. Stand-up goaltenders, it's interesting. There are still a few stand-up goaltenders, but there's no pure stand-up goaltender left. The interesting thing was that in that era, Patrick Roy could make this ridiculous butterfly attempt and miss. And it looked like the effort was there, whereas the stand-up goalie, if he missed, it looked like the effort wasn't there. So that's part of the reason why when people say, "Did you see the goalies back then?" Yeah, because they were a lot of them were stand-up goaltenders. They were smaller in stature as well. But yeah, when the puck went in, it looked like there was no effort. Whereas now a goaltender could be diving crazy and wildly, and it feels like it starts there. Now, Hasek definitely inspired the crazy, ridiculous, just swim around in the crease and do whatever you can to make those saves. But yeah, there's some revolutionaries there. Ovechkin, of course, is going to end up catching Gretzky in all likelihood, although it's been slower for him the second half of this season. Maurice Richard, 50 goals in 50 games. Before that was the thing. Connor McDavid has to be on the board because look at the totals he's putting up. Mark Messier, leader, who had 6 cup rings in his career, brought one to New York, and so he deserves to be in the conversation. And I've also included Jean Beliveau, who's part of a long history of players in Montreal who were just absolutely excellent. So where Crosby ranks in terms of these players is all subjective. To me, and again, going by the players I've seen in my lifetime, I would put Gretzky at 1, Lemieux at 2, and Crosby has to be at 3. In my eyes, he has to be. McDavid, I would still have at 4 for the reason that Crosby's had 3 Stanley Cups. When we look at what he's done in his career, it is nothing short of remarkable. So he's named captain of the Penguins May 31st of 2007 at age 19. And he's missed a grand total of 213 games by my count. I went through and I hand counted, and if I missed a game or overcounted something here and there, fine. But 213 games. So he should be in the 1,750 point range right now, or maybe more, because some of those games were missed in his early seasons where he was putting up really, really good point totals. And that's basically the case. Players will usually have their most productive seasons in their early to mid-20s, and then it'll tail off a bit from there. But he's won 2 Conn Smythes, 2016, 2017. He has 3 Stanley Cup rings, 2 Hart trophies in 2007 and 2014. Won the Ted Lindsay, 2007, 2013, and 2014. Rocket Richard Trophy, 2010 and 2017. So he can score goals as well. Like McDavid's proving that this year. It's almost as if McDavid said, I can score goals, watch. And he's going out and he's leading the league in goal scoring. Messier Leadership Award was in 2010. So Crosby could have been argued as a Hall of Fame candidate in 2007 when he wins the Hart, the Ted Lindsay, and the Art Ross. And then, of course, a couple years later, he wins his first Stanley Cup with Pittsburgh. The back-to-back Conn Smythes. And I felt like Phil Kessel, you could argue, could have had one of those two Conn Smythe awards. Kessel was fantastic, but, I mean, Crosby really took control of that team. I thought the 2017 run was more impressive for me with Crosby than the 2016 one, although they were both very impressive. On an international stage, the guy's a winner. 2010, 2014 Olympic gold, 2015 World Championships, gold, 2016 the World Cup, he wins gold, 2005 he wins gold at the World Juniors, and that was a year after he won silver at the World Juniors. And again, he has missed a lot of games with injury. The record Pittsburgh's put up when he's been injured, it feels like it's pretty good generally, but it's in part because they've been able to build a pretty good team around Sidney Crosby. Once you get that player with Crosby, and then a year later, Malkin as well, right? So when you've got that going on and you've got those players in your organization, it is easier to acquire other players via free agency and via trade. All of a sudden, you're not on the no-trade list. Teams are like, oh, I could play with Sid. Yeah, no, I can go to Pittsburgh. That'll be fine. Whereas before Crosby got there, odds are Pittsburgh would have been on some no-trade lists because it was kind of a disaster the few seasons before he got there. But here we are. He is one of the best of all time. And again, I don't know that we'll ever have any consensus at any point when it comes to the greatest of all time. But I also think that the criticism of one era towards the other is really weird. And I do not indulge in that. I don't get into that because I've seen era adjusted. Well, why don't you do this? Well, because comparing across eras is virtually impossible for various reasons. So while you may want to take away from a record that's set now with something that happened years ago, you can do that the same the other way around too, and the arguments can go on forever. But at any rate, Sidney Crosby, 1,500 points. I guess the question becomes, can he stay healthy and play long enough to get to 2,000 points? Where's the ceiling? Does he get to 1,800? Does he pass Gordie Howe's all-time points total? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.